Hello, everybody. Welcome to our program this evening, hosting Jane Ruby, President of the League of Women Voters of Chicago, who will talk to us about her amazing experience as a delegate to the Commission on the Status of Women of the United Nations Social and Economic Council. But first, let me introduce Janie Seiden, who will tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters. Janie.
Okay. Well, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that it encourages us and encourages other people to learn more about government and to have an active vote, to study it and have an active voice in local, state, and national government. The league actually was begun in 1920 in Valentine's Day, February 14th, by the suffragettes, and was at the Congress Hotel in Chicago is where it actually began. So I think a lot of people are surprised by that. And I'm welcome to Jane and welcome to everybody here and enjoy the program.
All right. Thank you so much, Janie. All right, Jane, you can now share your screen and we'll let you begin. And you're muted. You want to unmute? There you go.
Hi everyone, I'm Jane Ruby. I wear many hats in League of Women Voters life. I am president of the Chicago League of Women Voters. I also sit on the statewide for League of Women Voters of Illinois Issues and Advocacy Committee under women's rights as the specialist for women's rights with an emphasis on ERA and CEDAW advocacy. And so I'll go a little bit into what CEDAW is later in my presentation. And just recently, I was actually wonderfully appointed to serve as a United Nations observer on behalf of League of Women Voters United States. So I sort of kind of have roles at many different levels of the League. And right now I'm representing the UN Observer Corps. So I will go ahead and share my screen and get right into our presentation. Can everyone see my screen?
We see your screen, but you haven't started the slideshow yet. There we go.
That better? Great.
Perfect.
So, often when I am talking with league people, there's a sort of we have to kind of start at the very, very beginning of the relationship between League of Women Voters, which is, a national organization around US democracy initiatives, but where did this relationship with the United Nations come from? So first, I'm going to offer a little history about the League and the United Nations and an introduction to the Commission on the Status of Women. In 1945, so right at the end of World War II, having just concluded the most destructive war in human history, delegates from 50 nations met in San Francisco to complete and sign the United Nations Charter. There, they vowed to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. At President Harry S. Truman's invitation, dozens of non-governmental organizations joined the United States delegation as official consultants. One of them, and only one of three organizations led entirely by women, was the League of Women Voters. The League sprang into action in support of this new United Nations Charter. We trained more than 5,000 volunteer speakers and distributed more than 1 million brochures in fewer than 6 months, helping ordinary Americans understand what this new United Nations would mean for their lives and why the United States should be a part of it. Now, to put it in perspective, think about the scale of what that effort really was like. There was no social media. There were no email lists, there were no Zoom briefings. League members literally organized public meetings, spoke to community groups, distributed printed material, contacted elected officials, and carried the case for international cooperation directly into neighborhoods around the country. Like, this was a massive undertaking that our organization was a part of. This was sort of the first of its kind civic education campaign that kind of wove multiple facets of our organization's DNA. First, this sort of was the way that it established the League's bridging between these global institutions and local voters. Secondly, women citizens demonstrated that they could shape world affairs without holding formal office. We were able to sort of use our foundation of educating women, organizing, and then turning that into national policy. Obviously, the vote passed in the US Senate, and the United Nations Charter was ratified. So it's really cool when you think about kind of the history of the United Nations. The League is a huge factor in why we even have a United Nations in the first place. So that's where it's like also, everyone should sort of wear that as a badge of honor, being a League member, and then also knowing how much our organization contributed not only to suffrage and human rights, but this global peace institution. Fast forward a little bit, so we have the United Nations set up. Now, we are going to talk about the history of the Commission on the Status of Women. So that was set up in 1946, 80 years ago, during the earliest days of the UN. And it was a functional commission of the Economic and Social Council, which is commonly known as ECOSOC. CSW was given a mandate to advance women's rights and gender equality. At the founding, this commission consisted of representatives from 15 governments. All 15 of those original representatives were women. That's a pretty cool thing when you think about the state of gender equality in 1940s diplomacy. At the time that the United Nations Charter was signed, women were generally not in the rooms where international decisions were being made. The women of the founding CSW were committed to changing that. The pledge shown on the slide, you could see it in italics on the screen, shows the ambition of this particular commission. They intended to raise the status of women across national, racial, linguistic, and religious boundaries, establishing equality in every field of human endeavor and eliminating discrimination in both written law and in the customary practices through which law is interpreted. That was an audacious mission in 1946. In many respects, it remains unfinished even to this day. The commission has grown over the decades. It now has a representative from each of the 45 member states elected by ECOSOC to 4-year terms, and women continue to constitute a majority of these delegates. But the CSW is not simply a gathering of women talking to other women. It is an intergovernmental body charged with examining what governments are doing, exposing what they have failed to do, and charting the course for what must happen next in order to achieve genuine equality. So what does the commission actually do? Its first responsibility is to promote gender equality and the full participation of women in political, economic, civic, and social life. Its second is to review that progress. The commission monitors how governments are implementing international commitments, including the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, adopted at the historic Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995. A lot of you might remember that that particular United Nations conference that happened in Beijing in 1995, that was the one where Hillary Clinton gave, an amazing historic speech about gender equality. That's sort of how people remember that particular moment. The third responsibility of CSW is to recommend policy. Each year, the Commission examines a priority theme and develops recommendations for governments, international institutions, and civil society. That includes League of Women Voters. We are a civil society organization. These recommendations are not the same as a law passed by Congress or a village board, but they are enormously important. They establish international standards, influence national legislation, and they guide funding decisions and provide advocates with a common framework against which governments can be held accountable. The CSW also raises awareness. It brings attention to challenges that governments might otherwise ignore and provides women's organizations with a platform to share evidence, propose solutions, and speak directly to decision makers. All of this work is closely tied to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 global objectives adopted in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And you can see the colored wheel on the screen right here is sort of the visual depiction of the SDGs. If any of you are presidents of local leagues or have been presidents of local leagues recently, you'll see on the annual survey from League of Women Voters United States, they ask you like how does your league implement the SDGs? So this is what it's referencing. The commission naturally focuses most directly on Sustainable Development Goal 5, which you can see it's sort of like the orange reddish one. That's gender equality, like in the wheel of colors. But generally, women's rights cannot be sort of neatly defined just in one little category. All of the SDGs sort of interact with each other very deeply, and they're all interconnected, which is why like the visual of it is a circle. Women's equality affects whether families escape poverty, which is SDG number 1, no poverty, whether children receive an education, which is SDG 4, whether communities can respond to climate change, which is SDG 13, whether public health systems function, which I forget which one, but it's definitely one of them, and whether societies are peaceful and demographic. That's SDG 16. Now we get to sort of how the league works with CSW. Since the league has been involved with the United Nations since its inception, our relationship to CSW in particular has been around for just as long. President Truman actually invited the league to serve as a consultant to the U.S. delegation at the UN Charter Conference in 1945. And that very much opened up doors as us, as a trusted civil society organization. In 1997, the League was granted special consultative status within ECOSOC. That status gives the League the opportunity to submit formal statements, participate in consultations, and engage with the UN in areas which we can be a specialist in. So, things around democracy and voting and women's rights, we are seen as a specialist in those fields and can consult with the ECOSOC Council around. With that, the League sort of set up this observer program in order to allow League members to participate in this unique relationship with the United Nations. So the Observer Core team at LWS serves as the League's ears and eyes within the UN system. Our core monitor proceedings, develop relationships with non-governmental institutions, organize with different organizations. We communicate our positions, our impact on issues book. We're able to speak in a global context about our positions. We identify emerging issues and help connect international work with advocacy at the state and local level. So it's sort of like that, kind of corny, but very, very true. Think globally, act locally concept. Through the years, we have collaborated with government representatives and civil society organizations on issues including women's empowerment, democratic participation, voting rights, violence prevention, human rights, climate change, and sustainable development. Our first representative to the commission was a woman named Dorothy Kenyon. And in the 20s, she was one of like the coolest leaguers ever. She was just like, really badass and awesome. She spent decades fighting for social justice and women's rights, and a lot of the foundation of her work and her activism really originated with the League. So she was a member of the New York League and served as its official legal advisor. She actually led a campaign to overturn a state law that barred women from serving on juries, and this was in the 1920s. That issue sort of provides an early example of the relationship between formal rights and access to justice, which is sort of a running theme in a lot of the work that we do in the League and also in our relationship with the United Nations. Um, the defense of sort of, and how important that project of hers really was, even though at that point women were considered full citizens, when they're excluded from juries, they are also excluded from interpreting the law, judging evidence, and determining what justice means in actual cases. And Dorothy Kenyon understood that democracy requires more than rights written on paper. It requires women to be present inside the institutions where those rights are enforced. So it's sort of that very much thinking globally, acting locally to demand justice and change in our systems based on, her experiences of working in this sort of global system. Um, I'll also like to highlight, so the woman with the hat is Dorothy Kenyon, and then the woman in orange above, that's Connie Sensor, who's our current chief UN observer. You might have seen her at sort of previous League conventions. She unfortunately won't be able to make it to this upcoming national convention because she's actually doing a project at the United Nations. But there will be a team of observers there for you to talk to. So this slide goes into some of the really important things that we've been a part of through the years at the United Nations. And for those of you who are League members, this is very cool to kind of be able to brag about. Some of this stuff is really, really groovy. So, one of the big things that we did through the United Nations was advocate for a post-war international economic system. We submitted testimony concerning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which many of you know is Eleanor Roosevelt. That was very much her big project. We sent delegations to every United Nations World Conference on Women, starting in 1975 when the first International Conference on Women was held in Mexico City. In the very early years, League observers would send information from New York, so like, through snail mail because we obviously didn't have technology, but like the observers who were there at the United Nations in New York really made a conscious effort to ensure that local leagues were equipped with information coming out of the United Nations at the time. And getting information from like the World Health Organization, UNESCO, like all of the big things, like we were in the rooms when all of this was happening. Another really cool thing that we were part of in 1957, the League submitted testimony which helped build support for the Senate approval of the statute establishing the International Atomic Energy Agency. Pretty cool. In the 60s, we organized state-by-state advocacy urging Congress to meet the United States peacekeeping obligations to help avert a UN financial crisis. And these are just like, a few examples of, really ways that the League has sort of stepped into this sort of international role. Which leads me to sort of our next section, which is talking about CEDAW. So CEDAW is short for the Convention on Ending Discrimination Against Women. Now, let's go back to 1975. long before I was born. Um, but many of you might have been around then. So 1975 was declared the International Women's Year. And by that point, this Commission on the Status of Women had developed resolutions addressing equal pay, political participation, education, health, and other individual issues. But member states, women's organizations, and league observers agreed that a patchwork of separate resolutions wasn't enough. We needed a comprehensive treaty that would pull all of these rights together. And then by creating a comprehensive treaty, it would then compel governments around the world to actually, ratify the treaty and enact these things. So we were really thinking like big and bold in 1975. After it took 4 years of drafting it, and afterward, the United Nations General Assembly adopted CEDAW in December of 1979. The treaty entered into force in 1981. As of today, 189 states are parties to this convention. So that means that 189 countries and territories have agreed to work towards this goal of ending discrimination against women. To appreciate that, like, how cool it was in 1981 that this treaty was ratified, and like how groundbreaking that was. Remember in that time how limited the legal protections against sex discrimination were in the 70s. So the mechanism of this treaty is it addresses both discrimination in public and private life. It obligates states to work towards eliminating discrimination not only by governments, but also organizations, employers, and enterprises. The best way that I've been told to think about it is it's sort of like ERA, like the Equal Rights Amendment, is sort of this nice little like package deal of like the gender equality is a thing. And then CEDAW is the data and reporting mechanism for how you prove that you're actually, as a government, adhering to the idea that we have gender equality. CEDAW also recognizes what is called temporary special measures. And those are sort of target goals, affirmative measures, or other time-limited policies designed to accelerate equality. So basically, you're not going to just snap your fingers and everything in this treaty is fine and great and everything's working. It understands that things take time to really ensure that we're working towards it. So countries that sign on to this treaty, every few years they have to basically defend that they're adhering to the treaty and working towards it. And the commission um, analyzes it and says, yes, you're doing a good job of ensuring you're meeting your metrics towards gender equality. Um, I think a couple of years ago, there was actually a country, I forget which one, but it was like a fairly newer country, and they actually got a failing grade on their report on CEDAW. So they were all like, really arrogant, being like, look, this is our first report on CEDAW. And the commission came back and was like, actually, you didn't really do everything you were supposed to this time. Like, come back and try again. So, there is really sort of mechanisms in place to ensure that countries that are adhering to this treaty are actually, doing the job. Another way to sort of phrase it is that it is an International Women's Bill of Rights. And you can see here kind of, a summary of what I just said, that the mechanisms at place for it. Now to a little bit of an awkward part, the US relationship to this really, really cool, amazing treaty that is designed to work towards no discrimination and gender equality. So if you look at this amazing visual, there are 6 countries that have not ratified this or adopted any form of the CEDAW treaty. To put it in context, it's been 45 years and the United States has still not ratified this. So President Jimmy Carter did sign this treaty in 1980. But as with all international treaties, they do have to go through Senate approval. So, although he signed it, it has still not gone through Senate ratification. Um, we are only one of 6. The others include Iran, Palau, Somalia, Sudan, and Tonga. So it is quite an eclectic group of countries that have also not ratified this international treaty. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has considered it, and hearings through the years have happened to, possibly put it to a vote. And it has pulled overwhelmingly in support and favor of it being called to a vote, but through the years, through every president since Jimmy Carter, this has been considered and it has not been put to a vote ever in the Senate. So this is really sort of a bipartisan issue. It is not, one administration as a roadblock to this, which is a very important distinction to make. And it sort of puts us in a very complicated position with regards to sort of diplomatic relations when we're one of the countries that has not agreed to this. So which I'm going to go into a little bit later, the ways in which advocacy around this has sort of really taken shape. So local leagues. The federal inaction is a roadblock in an international sense, but it doesn't mean that civil society and local governments have to remain inactive. So we don't have to sit around, and we haven't sat around just waiting for the Senate to jump into action on this one. Actually, at the 2024 U.S. Convention in D.C., if any of you were there, delegates voted overwhelmingly, like over 99%, to support continued league work on CEDAW. The Chicago League actually was the sponsor organization for this resolution. And so the local leagues, the way that we've sort of handled it is in the same way that ERA has happened, where there's been sort of this roadblock at the national level. It's really been state and local organizations and activists who have really jumped in to sort of fill in the gaps on what our federal government hasn't been able to do. Local leagues have been very involved in passing CEDAW ordinances at the local and state and county levels. Basically for 20 plus years there's been a big movement. San Francisco was the first city to do a CEDAW ordinance, and they still have an active CEDAW ordinance now. Places like California, LA, Toledo, Ohio, there's a county, Montgomery County in Maryland. Like there's all of these sort of local grassroots efforts to build out CEDAW compliant territories as a way, to sort of show that this methodology works. And CEDAW has been very much a foundation of the league's position on this treaty. So part 3, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what it's like to be at one of these CSW conventions. Actually, the one that just happened this March was the 70th one that has been held. I think I said before the recording started, um, the National Branch of League of Women Voters, so League of Women Voters United States, every year does a call out for members to apply to be delegates to this you know, it's a commission, but it's kind of, it's kind of a convention. So there's a call to action. You can apply to be a delegate. They have, X number of slots. You can go to New York and serve as a delegate on behalf of League of Women Voters United States. There's lots of other civil society organizations that participate in it too, both, from the United States and abroad. So it's like a wide variety. So I have gone to this event every year for the past 3 years, and this was the first time that I served in sort of my official UN observer role. But I also have, just as myself, served as a delegate on two other previous years. So, this year's theme was ensuring and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls. So every year they kind of pick a different theme that sort of guides the direction of the conference. Um, what that theme was hoping to do was include in promoting inclusive and equitable legal systems, eliminating discriminatory laws and practices, and addressing the structural barriers that prevent women from obtaining justice. The full theme examined women's full and active participation in decision-making and public life, and obviously the elimination of violence and discrimination against women and girls is a constant theme throughout. This year, and the theme has, it's always, because the US has not signed on to CEDAW, it always makes it sort of really awkward being at this conference and representing America, being American in these spaces, because it's always like, well, why the US hasn't signed on to CEDAW. There's also, to put it in context, which is sort of, would be a whole separate other thing, but there's a bunch of human rights related treaties that the US has not signed on to, including the Treaty on the Rights of Children and the Treaty on the Rights of Disabled and Handicapped People. And so it's a very complicated, international space around why the US doesn't sign on to these things. But when you're in these spaces and your government is seen as sort of hostile and not very supportive or accommodating to themes around human rights, and this is since the UN's founding, it makes it even more important being an American organization, being an organization that is devoted to democracy, gender equality, and equity initiatives. It makes our job, very, very serious to be a different representation of what America really stands for. And so, we don't serve in a role that, we are not diplomats, we are not acting in any State Department capacity, but we can still talk about, what the League stands for, the projects we're working on, and can be a force in, learning and talking to other organizations around the world about the work that we do. Um, So, oh, this slide makes me so happy. So, as I was also saying uh, before we started recording, the first time I went to the United Nations was 3 years ago, for my first time serving as a delegate. And when I walked in, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so at home. Um, Going to the United Nations, if anyone can go to New York, you could take a tour, or serve as a delegate on behalf of the League to the next one, which I highly recommend if you can. But there's something really special about being in a space that is so intentionally designed and created to, be of peace and be of global participation and support. And so these are just some groupings of some delegates. You can see like the really groovy like Star Trek Gold Room, like that's the General Assembly room. Um, the picture with like the orange triangles on the wall, like that's the echo chamber. So the space itself is very intentionally designed to sort of mimic this commitment to international peace and diplomacy. There's a lot of really beautiful art. There's a lot of really beautiful objects that span the history of the United Nations in the spaces there. And so when you're there, you really sort of feel the um the weight of the importance of being in these spaces. I know for me, and I think a lot of people sort of mimic the sentiment of like when you hear about stuff at the United Nations, it's often coming out of the Security Council, and it, is more geared towards the diplomatic and efforts and initiatives. And really, there's so, like, the more core heart and soul of what the UN is about is really the civil society and cultivating these global relationships and partnerships and collaborations and ways and spaces for us to learn from each other and bring that back into our local work. So one of my favorite stories is last year, I was at a event that the Irish Mission was hosting, and I afterward went up to the ambassador to the UN on behalf of Ireland, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, like, you just did an amazing event on, for this conference." And he was like, he saw my league button and was like, "What is going on with the Save Act?" And it was just like, I wanted to talk to him about what was going on with Ireland, but he, identified that, I was there representing, America in a civil society capacity. And this was even, before the league's big effort and push around the SAVE Act education and um efforts. And so I was just like, oh, okay, like you want to know what's going on in America, you want to know what we're doing to combat this, like, all right, I'm here to talk to you about that. But, it's like the world is paying attention to what is happening here, and these spaces are very sacred to be able to like have actual conversations in ways that, we kind of take for granted both what the UN seems to be about and like, what we can actually do conversationally. Um and I think like just to sort of clarify, you know, um, the League, we are not a diplomatic institution. We are civil society. We are, an organization. So, we don't really have the jurisdiction to enforce laws or issue any sort of decisions, but we can work towards creating conditions in which the public institutions can be held accountable. So, CEDAW is a great example of that, where, there's a void in what our government is doing in an accountability in an international sense. And league members are jumping in and saying, okay, well, we need to fill in those gaps at the local, county, and state levels. And so that's really where there's been pushes to sort of, fill in those gaps that our government isn't working on. And I think that, that's really sort of the essence of what the UN is really there to do and provide framework and inspiration and guidance and collaboration on ways that we can sort of, really use a lot of this international framework at the local state levels. Um, so with that, I'll kind of close out my presentation because I want to leave enough time for questions, but I do want to leave everyone with this. So to put in perspective, in 1945, League members helped Americans understand why the United States should join a new international institution dedicated to peace, human rights, and cooperation. In 2026, our responsibility has changed, but it's no less urgent. We really must continue translating global commitments into public understanding and local action. We must insist that equality be measured not only by the language of our laws, but by the lives people are able to lead. We must defend the civic space in which women can organize, speak, vote, advocate, and hold institutions accountable. That's sort of a common theme of how we can kind of engage, with all of this. And more importantly, we must remember that the League's place at the United Nations is an integral part of the work that we all do, whether you realize it or not, as League members, or partners who do a lot of work with the League. The UN is a vital arena in which we carry out the mission that we all do our work on, and empowering voters, defending democracy, and ensuring that every person has a meaningful voice in the decisions that shape their lives. Thank you, Rosemary and the Deerfield Lincolnshire League, for welcoming me to brag about how cool the UN is and how excited I am to be able to do these sorts of presentations for local league chapters. And with that, I know it's a lot of information, but I'd love to, open it up for any sort of questions or comments or, feedback from y'all.
Wonderful. I'm going to stop the recording. Jane, this was just phenomenal. I know people have questions. We're so pleased that you came, and I did not know a lot of this. So I really learned a lot. I'm going to stop the recording for the questions. Okay.